I know that many of you are familiar with my work and the videos I have worked on in the past. Well, if you are, then you have probably seen my video on the stalking strangler Carlton Gary. The reason I bring this up is because the first feature of today's episode is connected to the stalking strangler. It's about William Hance, a black man, a military man, and a serial killer. He operated between 1977 and 1978 in Georgia. The thing that makes William Hance special though is very interesting, because he tried to use the stalking stranglings to his advantage. He saw an opportunity to blame his own murders on a white supremacist group, one that didn't exist. But we can't just jump in like that. We need to start from the beginning. William Hance was stationed at Fort Benning, close to Columbus, Georgia. Not that much is known about him. He fell into the shadow of the stalking strangler, but one thing is for sure: there was something very disturbing going on inside his head. The first victim is unclear. Many sources connect the murder of 24-year-old Army Private Karen Hickman to William Hance, but honestly, I haven't seen any real evidence of that. But that doesn't mean he didn't do it. You see, Karen Hickman, also living at the Fort Benning barracks, had a thing for black men. She exclusively dated other black soldiers stationed there, and she herself was white. Nothing wrong with that, but it sort of confuses things, because the two very much confirmed victims attributed to Hance were black prostitutes. Serial killers usually have a type, and then stick to that type. John Wayne Gacy liked handsome teenage boys. It would be weird if the crime scene investigators all of a sudden dug up a 50-year-old man, but maybe I'm just looking too much into it. Preferences vary. I suppose they can vary just as much with serial killers. Anyway, Karen Hickman was found brutally murdered on the Fort Benning grounds one day. She had been struck several times with a blunt object. She had been stripped naked and then been run over with a car, over and over again. The discovery would have caught more attention if it wasn't for the elusive serial killer operating in Columbus, the stalking strangler. And that's another part of the case of William Hance that makes it interesting. No one caught on to his activities until he injected himself into the stalking stranglings. Who knows, maybe he could have gotten away with it. A few months went by and the murder of Karen Hickman got colder. It was now February of 1978 and William Hance struck again. Or perhaps this was his first strike. Regardless, he wasn't exactly a good person. Gail Jackson was a prostitute. I'm sure she had been picked up by the military man from Fort Benning before, but this time would be very different for her. William Hance picked her up in his car and started negotiating. But at some point, I'm not sure if it was before or after sex, he took out a jackhandle and began striking her in the face with it. He hit her so many times, so hard that you could barely recognize her afterwards. This was his outlet. Whatever built up issues he had, whatever darkness he needed to give into, he had just done that. He dumped her on Fort Benning grounds, lifeless and broken. Only a couple of weeks went by before he struck again. This time he picked up Irene Thurkield, another black prostitute, another victim fallen into the shadows of the stalking stranglings. Well, she wasn't really found right away, but both Irene and Gail had been missing, but the police just couldn't focus. Their focus was on the serial killer in Columbus. They couldn't see the pattern. They didn't realize that another serial killer was operating as well. William Hance may never have reached the body count that Carlton Gary reached, but he was clearly of the same ilk, a boogeyman. The only real difference is that William Hance was really fucking stupid. William Hance killed Irene in the same way as he had killed Gail Jackson. He had struck her in the face several times with a jackhandle, but she was his last known victim. He had killed 2 maybe 3 women, and as the reality started to sink in that he might get caught for it, he got a brilliant idea. He began writing a letter. In the letter he said that Gail Jackson was being held captive and that she would be killed as retaliation if the police did not catch the stalking strangler or give them a bunch of money. It seemed legit. Gail Jackson was missing. Well, she was dead, but the police didn't know that. But William Hance just couldn't keep his bloodied fingers out of the cookie jar. He wrote more letters, just digging a deeper hole for himself. At one point he made a phone call pretending to be the leader of this made-up Nazi group, but the operator on the other end could hear that it sounded like a young black man talking. Not only that, but the letters were determined to have been written at Fort Benning, and this confirmed the investigators' suspicion. The killer was from inside the fort. As they began to narrow down their suspects, they found William Hance. He volunteered to be interviewed by them. The phone calls he had made were to give locations for the bodies of Gail and Irene. Gail was found covered with twigs and leaves, her body mutilated, and Irene was found in a similar way in a shallow grave. He did this to prove a point. He wanted to show the authorities that the group was serious and that they would continue to kill black women if the stalking strangler wasn't caught, or if he got some money. He thought he was convincing them that the group was behind it, but for every contact he made, he just proved the opposite. Back to the interrogation. William was grilled for a long time by both FBI and the Columbus police, and eventually admitted that he had written the letters and made the phone calls, but he said that the group had forced him to do it. That's usually how it goes. They strip the lies away piece by piece, and for every layer cut away, the truth gets clearer, and that's what happened with William Hance. The group of Nazis never existed. It was all him. He probably thought he was smart, that he could manipulate the events to his advantage. A dumb mistake, but a fortunate one, because even the stupid serial killers are dangerous. I mean, the title is self-explanatory, isn't it? It wasn't until the spring of 1994 that William Hance paid the ultimate price for the lives he had taken, because it was on that April day that he was executed. Electrocuted. Jolts of electricity putting out his flame for good. This second feature was originally going to be about Charles Albright, also known as the Texas Eyeball Killer, but I realized something while working on this video. Charles Albright isn't the small-time obscure serial killer that I thought he was. He's a big one. I debated whether to cut him down for the double feature, but I don't want to do that. If I'm telling a story, I want to tell as much as I feel necessary, and his story is just too long. Don't worry though, I will put him on the back burner of future Ages of Murder episodes. Now, let's forget about Charles. I replaced him with another killer for the second feature, one that is very obscure and very unknown. His name is Roy Mitchell. It is no doubt a sensitive and complicated case to discuss. I mean, Roy Mitchell, a black man killing white people in Waco, Texas in the early 1920s, is bound to be controversial to many. Not only did an innocent black man get shot dead and burned down by an angry mob for his crimes, the question of whether Roy himself was innocent also came into question. One thing though is for sure, there was a black man responsible for 5 murders between 1922 and 1923 in Waco, Texas. But the problem back then was the question of whether or not the police officers put enough focus on making sure the right black man was hung for the crimes. Either way, we can get to the racially sensitive parts of the story later, because at the end of the day, Roy Mitchell probably was the Waco Lover's Lane killer, and with a name like that, regardless of race, there is a story to tell. So, let's tell it. It began in the spring of 1922, May 7th to be exact. On that day, William Driscoll, a cotton buyer and part-time deputy, was attacked by someone in his garage. The attacker had an axe with him and he used it. He chopped the clueless man down and robbed him of his gun, his watch and his ring. It seemed like an isolated incident, like it was one of those robberies gone wrong. But little did they know that the storm had just arrived to Waco, Texas. A killer, now with a gun, was preying on them. It took 2 weeks for the killer to begin his real work, the sort of hunting that got his cock hard and his dark side stimulated. May 25th, 1922, Harvey Bolton, a 21-year-old dapper young man, was sitting in his car with his young girlfriend. It was on a secluded road outside of Waco, essentially a lover's lane. This happened more than 40 years before the Zodiac-haunted lover's lanes, and over 20 years before the Phantom Killer would do the same. During the young lover's alone time on the secluded road, a man suddenly emerged from the bushes. A black man. Something was off about him, but there wasn't any time to figure out what it was. The man was still standing in front of the car when he raised his arm. Turns out he was holding a pistol. The man shot 3 times into the car, killing the young man, Harvey Bolton, 21 years old, instantly. He had other plans for the girl though. This is what he came for. The brutality. The man walked up to the girl and dragged her out of the car. She was sure she was gonna die on that night, but the man wouldn't kill her. Instead he raped her right there on the cold grass, with her boyfriend dead in the car beside them. After he had finished, he just ran away, back into the night. This is where the racial stuff comes in. The young girl, traumatized and raped, had pointed out a young black man named Jesse Thomas as her attacker. This prompted her father to shoot Jesse in the head and drag him to the town square, where he and a mob of angry citizens lit the body on fire. I understand the father's anger. He thought Jesse had murdered his daughter's boyfriend and then raped her, but eyewitnesses can be kind of unreliable, especially since it was connected with the trauma of assault that she suffered. She probably thought Jesse was the right man. Had this happened today, he would have been taken in and cleared, because he was an innocent man, caught up in the whirlwind of the killer that had arrived in town. The prejudice that festered back then enabled an innocent man dead, and the killer to keep on killing. November 20, 1922. Grady Skipworth, a 19-year-old young man, was sitting in his car on a spot known as Lover's Leap with his girlfriend, Naomi Boucher. Just like his previous attack, the killer emerged from the darkness and walked towards the car. They were confused. Had they known that the Lover's Lane killer was still loose, they might have been a tad more careful, but that was all forgotten by that point. The man this time carried a shotgun with him, and he coldly raised it up and blew 19-year-old Grady's head off. He then picked Grady's body up and walked to the cliff nearby. He tossed the body off of the ledge and returned to assault the terrified young woman cowering in the car. After he had raped her, he dragged her to the cliff as well and threw her off. But it didn't go as smoothly with her because she was still alive, kicking and screaming. She wasn't thrown out far enough. She landed in some trees and this broke her fall. She was injured and degraded, but she had survived. Just like the previous survivor, she pointed out a black man responsible, and this time the citizens and authorities of Waco did the right thing. They didn't lynch anyone, but gave him a trial, and the man she had pointed out was found not guilty by an all-white jury. Some time went by, and on January 10, 1923, the killer tried to attack again. This time he ran into a car driven by a couple down a lonely road. He leapt onto the front of the car trying to shoot through the windshield, but he was unsuccessful. He was thrown off the car, and by the time police arrived, he was long gone. But he had left something behind, a checkered cap. 10 days later, another couple was attacked sitting in their car. This time though, the brutal killer left no survivors. He had approached the car like he had done twice before, surely confusing the couple inside. The man, W.E. Holt, was killed with a single gunshot to the head. Then it was time for his real target, Ethel Dennekamp. Ethel Dennekamp were dragged from the car, she was raped and then beaten to death, viciously. Afterwards, their killer dumped their bodies in a field. He had clearly gotten more brazen, jumping onto cars, throwing a living woman off a ledge. He was a typical example of a sexual sadist, one of those serial killers driven solely by their dark desires. The men were just collateral damage, shot down, a nuisance. The women, though, he wanted to rape them, he wanted to hurt them. He could have shot them too, given them a so-called clean death, but he wanted it to be more personal and brutal. So he threw one off the ledge, kicking, screaming and begging for mercy, and the other one he beat to death after he had raped her. But fortunately for the citizens of Waco, his reign of terror was over. A person came forward identifying the cap as belonging to 30-year-old Roy Mitchell. People have throughout the years claimed that he was unjustly sentenced to death, that the confession he made was coerced. But he made the connection to detectives. He told them that it was killing William Driscoll and stealing his gun that gave him the upper hand, the pistol he would use in his crimes. And Roy Mitchell wasn't like Jesse, he was a good friend to the chief of police. If he had been truly innocent, it is very likely that his good friend would have made sure that he wasn't sentenced for the crimes. But he was. He was actually the last person to be executed by a public hanging in Texas. The hanging occurred in downtown Waco in front of 5,000 to 7,000 onlookers. He was hung on July 30, 1923. His last words were, "Goodbye, everybody." Could he have been innocent? Yeah, he could have been. And yes, Texas in the early 20s was a rough place for black people. But that doesn't change the fact that someone was preying on the innocent. Someone was raping and shooting their way through the young lovers of Waco. That someone was a black man. That's a fact. And the fact that Roy Mitchell's cap was found in an attempted murder scene and that the crime suddenly stopped once he was arrested gives me reason to believe that yes, he was guilty. Because it wasn't a ghost killing people, someone was. And the evidence I can find points to Roy. Either way, what use is there to debate the politics of a crime that's nearly 100 years old? At the end of the day, it's not about race or prejudice, even though it does play a part in the story of Roy Mitchell, the lover-slain killer of Waco, Texas. He is no different from any other serial killer, just an evil piece of shit, fulfilling his dark fantasies.